American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to say hello to all of you, but I also want to say hello to the folks that are on the internet watching. We've started live streaming what we consider to be our better events or things that are interesting, and I know a number of the folks that were watching this morning were expecting to see me at 9 a.m. here, but I was stuck on a red eye, came in late. You'll hear all that story another day if you want to have drinks after this is over. But I came in late, but I do want to thank everyone for their patience. You know, some years ago, the Pew Charitable Trusts funded a project to begin looking at globalization and what the rest of the world thought about us and what we were doing and how America ranked in the eyes of others. I really like this project because one of the most popular programs I used to do at New America and also at the Economic Strategy Institute, and occasionally when I worked in the Senate for Senator Jeff Bingaman, is I would invite journalists, bureau chiefs from other countries to come in and talk about U.S. policy or U.S. place in the world. We would bring in sometimes ambassadors or just various people that we would find down in DuPont Circle who we knew came from elsewhere, because there weren't enough sort of offshore narratives that we were listening to about us. America is very, very indulgent, I think, about its place in the world, its influence, and there wasn't much benchmarking of all of this. And I was pleased that Pew brought in a great number of people to work on this, two of whom are here today, but one of them was Bruce Stokes. And Bruce has been with this project from the very beginning, having written a book on this subject with Andy Kohut, who many people know from the Pew Research Center. And Bruce, as many of you know, is the international economics columnist for National Journal. He's a consultant with the Pew Global Attitudes Project. We also have his associate here, Richard White, who's associate director of the Pew Global Attitudes Project. This is my first time to meet Richard, and I'm very, very interested in what the findings are. But a bit about Bruce Stokes and the role he's played. He is one of the most interesting people because trying to figure out what Bruce Stokes does is somewhat complicated, because the lines of how he performs as a public intellectual in this town are part journalist at National Journal. He for quite a long time for the Council on Foreign Relations ran their international economics program. He's been associated with the German Marshall Fund. He's been associated with the New America Foundation. He's primarily a journalist with National Journal. I want to emphasize that point. But what's nice about it is that Bruce is an activist in helping us to think through the contours of what's going on in the geostrategic realm, but also the geoeconomic realm. And there aren't enough folks like that. And he's been a very important mentor to me and guide in my evolution here in Washington. And I'm not doing this as any personal favor. It's just an opportunity to do this. I'm doing this because this Pew survey has emerged, which was released, I think, on Thursday, has emerged as one of the key fundamental benchmarks of getting an understanding of how the rest of the world looks at us. Many of the folks watching today are watching on my blog, and I wrote a piece that I had my readers screaming at me about. And I apologize again, but I nonetheless wrote it, that when I was traveling around the world, one of the things that I noticed is that the battle between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had everybody glued to the newspaper, the TV, and you could feel as I was in China or Saudi Arabia or Japan or Brussels, the phenomenal interest in American politics, and I sort of had a feel, and I haven't looked at the results, that American popularity abroad increased in part because of that battle. So I said, let it go on, which many of my readers didn't like. But nonetheless, without further ado, please help me welcome Bruce Stokes and Richard White. And is Richard going first? Okay, but but remember all the nice things I said about Bruce. But without further ado, Richard White. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Bruce and I are going to split this up, and I'm going to sort of cover for you first some of the key findings from this report that we did put out late last week, particularly regarding America's image in the world and China's image in the world. And then Bruce will cover some of the other key findings and talk more about the implications for the next American president. So just to give you a little background on the survey, we conducted it in 24 countries around the world and interviewed over 24,000 people. And as you can see, we get a pretty good representation of countries from regions throughout the world. Last year we had a few more countries. We had 47, but this year, even with 24, we managed to hit all the major regions of the world. These are all nationally representative samples, for those of you who are a little bit more methodologically inclined, with 4 exceptions: China, India, Pakistan, and Brazil. In those 4 countries, the samples were disproportionately urban. And it was conducted over about a month's time from mid-March until April 21st. Now, just to sort of hit the highlights of what we did find regarding U.S. favorability, we've been tracking this since 2002, and really this year is the first time we've seen a slight uptick in how the world feels about the United States. U.S. favorability increased in 10 of the 21 countries where we have trends from last year. It declined in only 3 of those countries. And there were...
I'm going to give you this if you keep walking away.
Okay, sorry. And it declined in only 3 of those countries. It remained unchanged, basically, in 8 of those 21 countries. At the same time, I think it's worth noting that there's no overall sea change in terms of how the world feels about the United States. Favorable views of the U.S. remain low in Europe. We still have a very negative image in many predominantly Muslim countries. But one thing we did note this year, and as we've already talked about a little bit, there is widespread interest in the U.S. presidential race internationally, and that may be one thing that is helping boost up these numbers just a bit. At least half of those surveyed in Japan, Germany, Australia, Jordan, Britain say they're following the race at least somewhat closely. In fact, the Japanese are following it more closely than Americans at this point. People who are following it also tend to have a pretty optimistic view about the next administration and hope that they'll be able to change foreign policy for the better in their eyes. And as you'll see in a moment, we found a clear advantage for Obama internationally. He's generally viewed more favorably than John McCain. At the same time, while we do have some good news, there are a lot of challenges that remain, and Bruce will talk about all of these a little bit more in detail in a few moments. There's a lot of pessimism about Iraq, a lot of pessimism about Afghanistan, and we see overwhelming evidence in this poll that the types of economic problems that we're having in the United States are not limited to the United States. All around the world, people are much more negative about their economies than they were a year ago. And moreover, this is having a negative impact on America's image because people feel like the U.S. economy is having a negative effect on their own economy around the world. And then a final issue is the environment. Concerns about the environment are up, and people sort of blame the United States for many of the environmental problems that they see in the world. And this is our sort of most basic trend that we have on how the world feels about the United States. This is a very basic question. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the United States? And as you can see, it's a pretty clear pattern. You go back to the beginning of the decade, we had large majorities in Britain, France, and Germany telling us they had a favorable view of the United States. It's dropped off significantly over the course of this decade. Over the last year, we really haven't seen a lot of change in Europe. You get a slight improvement in Britain, slight improvement in France, but in truth, in a statistical sense, there really hasn't been any meaningful change. Now, this is the same question among Muslim respondents in some key Muslim countries around the world. And as you can see here, again, not a lot of change between 2007 and 2008. One notable exception is Indonesia, where we have seen a slight improvement in U.S. favorability over the last year. And of course, Indonesia, as you can see, is a country where we had relatively favorable views of the U.S. at the beginning of the decade.
Does that show Jordan at 0 in 2003?
It did. I think it might have been 1%.
1%.
Yeah.
Only those people who worked for the U.S. Embassy.
That was like the king?
Yeah, right.
Right, that's right.
And his immediate family.
We do actually have a 0 among Lebanese Shia this year. Literally not one Lebanese Shia respondent in the sample has a favorable view of the United States. It's actually 62% among Lebanese Sunni, and among Christians in Lebanon who aren't represented on this slide, it's 76%. So you've got these just stunning differences among the various religious communities in Lebanon. You don't see zeros very often in polling, so it's really pretty interesting. Here's the trend on the same question in Asia. As you can see, we actually had a pretty big improvement in South Korea in terms of America's image. Unfortunately, all this predates the recent protest over beef imports there. So I'm not an expert on South Korea, but I'm assuming if we went and asked this question today, we might get some different responses, and that 70% might drop down a little bit. It's also up a bit in India. It's up a little bit in China. It's down a little bit, actually, in Japan. Favorable ratings of the U.S. have dropped a little bit there over the last year. Same question in Latin America and in Africa. Again, sort of mixed patterns. It's dropped a little bit in Mexico. It's up in Argentina, although Argentina remains one of the most negative countries in the world as far as our polling goes in terms of how they feel about the U.S. Even though it's up, only 22% in Argentina say they have a favorable view of America. The biggest gain on the survey, actually, is in Tanzania. Last year, 45% have a favorable view of the U.S. 46%. This year, it's up to 65%. Maybe some of you might have some ideas about why that happened. I know Bush was there, I believe, in February, and maybe that had some impact. I don't know. But what we see is that Tanzania is starting to look a lot like the rest of Africa, which remains the one region where U.S. favorability is still pretty high. Now, as I said, one of the sort of main findings that I think jumps out of this survey is that people maybe are looking a bit beyond the Bush era. They're optimistic about the possibility of change in U.S. foreign policy come January '09, and you can see a little bit of that in this poll, in this slide. Among those who are paying attention to the race, we have large majorities in many countries who say that they think the next American administration is going to change American foreign policy for the better. Now, as far as the particular presidential contenders go, there's an overwhelming advantage for Barack Obama over John McCain in almost every country that we survey. We have a basic question that we ask about world leaders. We ask people whether they have confidence in them to do the right thing in world affairs. And as you can see here, significantly higher numbers in almost every country tell us they have confidence in Barack Obama than say that about John McCain. Huge gaps in Western Europe, in France, in Germany, in Britain, Spain. Unsurprisingly, a pretty big gap in Indonesia, where Obama spent part of his childhood. Really, the only part of the world where you don't see much of a gap is in some of the predominantly Muslim countries that we survey, Jordan, Turkey, Pakistan. Not a lot of confidence in either candidate in those countries. And then quickly, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we found regarding China's image in the world. We've seen an improvement, as I said, in America's favorability rating since last year. A different pattern for China. Its image has actually slipped a bit, particularly in Western Europe. I believe in France we had maybe a 19-point drop-off in China's favorability rating just since last year, and you see similar numbers elsewhere in Europe. I think this poll also reflects in a lot of ways China's emergence as a world power, and you can see that on some of our measures. For instance, in countries throughout the world, we have large numbers telling us that China has a lot of influence in their country, and you particularly see this in Asia, but in Africa as well. And there are a lot of concerns about China. There are worries about the safety of Chinese products. There are worries about China's impact on the global environment. There are concerns about China's growing economy, and people are seeing China as an economic competitor. And there's also a lot of concern about Chinese unilateralism. We've had a question that we've asked over the last several years about U.S. unilateralism, and we found that people think the U.S. doesn't really take into account the interests of countries like theirs when it makes foreign policy decisions. This year we asked the same question about China, and we find very similar numbers saying that China doesn't take into account their interests when it makes foreign policy decisions. And in some countries it's pretty striking. You get almost exactly the same numbers about China and about the U.S. Despite all this, we find pretty widespread support for holding the Summer Olympics in Beijing. Even countries like India that have pretty mixed views of China tend to say that they approve of holding the games there. There's a little less enthusiasm, however, in the West. In Western Europe, in the U.S., and Japan, more mixed views about the decision to hold the games there. And then just to sort of sum up what we've seen on this very broad measure of favorability towards both the U.S. and China, as I said, there are 21 countries where we have trends from last year, and America's image on this measure has actually improved in 10 of those countries. It's only gone down in 3. You have almost exact opposite pattern for China's favorability rating. It's dropped in 9 countries. It's only gotten better in 2, and it's remained about the same in 10. So actually, if you look across these 24 countries in the survey and look at the 24-country median favorability score, it's almost exactly the same for both the U.S. and China. About 46% saying they have a favorable view of the U.S., about 46% saying they have a favorable view of China. So there's really a lot of parity in many different ways in terms of how the world feels about the U.S. and about China. And with that, I'll turn it over.
Why don't I encourage Bruce to speak from this mic?
Okay, sure.
Be a little bit better.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. And it's a pleasure to be here and to talk a bit about what we consider to be possibly some of the challenges that are going to face the next president, whoever that may be, that come out of this data, because we do think that while it is encouraging that favorability of the U.S. has improved a bit around the world, we should bear in mind, if you go back to one of those original slides, how far it has fallen since 2000. Certainly, you take a snapshot, there's some reason for some hope. Take a moving picture, it seems to me it's still a fairly depressing picture in terms of favorability of the U.S. around the world. And while we didn't ask the question in this survey, we have asked the question in past surveys of those people who say they do not have a favorable view of the U.S., why is it they don't have a favorable view of the U.S.? And overwhelmingly, they've said it's President Bush. So clearly, with the passing of the Bush era, one might anticipate there'll be a honeymoon. There'll be a resurgence of support for the U.S., and yet I think we can overread that. I think it is natural. It's human nature to want to be liked, and it's human nature to want to believe that once you've changed, people recognize that change and reward you for that. I think we, in doing that, may underestimate how deep the hole is that we're in, and how broad it may be and how hard it may be to climb out of it. One of the other survey results that we found in past surveys is we would ask people who said they were unfavorably disposed towards the United States, is it President Bush or America who you don't like? Again, overwhelmingly people would say it was President Bush. But over the years, the number of people who said, well, no, actually it's America too I don't like, that's gone up. And what we've also seen is that there has been a steady erosion of support for Americans. What we knew historically from the Vietnam period, from the beginning of the Reagan administration, when we were trying to put missiles into Western Europe and there was a lot of anti-Americanism in Western Europe, what we knew from those periods was that people always liked Americans more than they liked America. And that's still the case today. If you look at the Pew data, there's a much greater support for the American people than there is for the United States. But our survey over 6-7 years now have shown a steady erosion of support for the American people. In part, I must say, because in 2005 we asked people if they thought more, asked people around the world, do you think more of the American people now that they've re-elected President Bush? And in fact, people said no. We think less of them because of that. So there is an interrelationship here that will change, it seems to me, once we have a new president, whoever that president may be. But the real question I think we need to address and we need to think hard about is the challenges that will face the next president. Because it does seem to me that the data suggest that this honeymoon may be short and there are problems still ahead. Now, how do I advance this? Here? Yeah. There's a number of challenges that emerge from the Pew data. As Richard mentioned, there is widespread pessimism about the war in Iraq. It continues, great pessimism. There is very little support for expanding the war in Afghanistan. And bear in mind that both Senator McCain and Senator Obama have at different times promised to increase the war in Afghanistan. So I think both of them run the risk of being that lieutenant who jumps out of the trench and says, "Follow me, boys," and there's nobody behind him. So I do think we have to be worried about that. There is a widespread pessimism about the economy, and basically widespread concern that the U.S. economy has a negative impact upon the individual economies of other countries. And so we are in part to blame for this concern about the economy. There's widespread concern about global warming. Again, people see us as one of the major culprits in terms of global warming. And as Richard mentioned, there's some very interesting data here about China. And it seems to me these pose both a challenge to the next president and an opportunity, which we'll get into. As I said, the pessimism about the Iraq war is fairly widespread. The question was, do you think the efforts to create a stable democratic Iraq government will succeed? We didn't ask a question about whether the war was a good idea or not. We've asked that many times in the past, and as one might expect, it was overwhelmingly negative around the world. We decided that was not the right question to ask anymore. This is about the future. You can see a fall-off in support for the war in the United States. Some upticks in places like Spain for reasons we can't fully explain, although when only 1 in 4 people are optimistic, I wouldn't say it's exactly a lot to write home about. Dramatic increase in support or optimism about Iraq in China, but again, still only 1 in 3 people are optimistic. And real drop-offs in Japan, in parts of Africa, and in parts of Europe. So the Iraq War is a millstone around the next president's neck, and even it seems to me, and here we're going beyond the data certainly, but if Senator Obama follows through in his pledge to begin the withdrawal, undoubtedly there are going to be complications, and this data does not suggest there's going to be a lot of tolerance for dealing with those complications. You can see there that the only region of the world where there seems to be a significant uptick is in the Middle East. Possibly that's hope over experience. Maybe they see something the American people, for example, don't. There is very little support for increasing the war in Afghanistan. As you can see, there is a plurality support for keeping troops in Afghanistan in Britain, a bare majority in the United States, very strong support in Australia, but beyond that, France has troops in Afghanistan. Majority of the population wants them out. There is very little support for the continued war effort in Afghanistan, and certainly it seems to me is going to be something that the next president is going to have to deal with. 72% of Pakistanis want Western troops out of Afghanistan, and the next president is obviously going to have to coordinate war efforts with the new Pakistani government, which is going to be a big challenge. The economy is on everyone's mind. This is probably one of the major results of this survey. I think to be expected, certainly, but still fairly strong. The somber mood that pervades, especially in the West. Look at those drop-offs in optimism about the economy in just 1 year in the United States and in parts of Western Europe. You can see overwhelmingly Koreans, the Lebanese, the Japanese, the French think the economy is in bad shape. There is some element of hope here in the sense that we also ask a question about whether people were feeling this in their own lives. And correct me if I'm wrong, Richard, but people were more optimistic about the economy in their own lives than they were about the country at large, which would suggest, it seems to me, that some of these economic problems had not hit the real economy yet. that people were not feeling the pinch. I don't know how we would avoid that, given all sorts of economic fundamentals, rise in food prices, rise in oil prices, et cetera. But certainly if we can avoid that, some of the negative political consequences of this may not ensue. But it's clear that people think their national economies are going very badly. And we asked people a two-part question. We said, do you think the United States economy has an influence on your economy? And widely speaking, people said yes, which is understandable given the fact that we're the global economic superpower that we are. And then we said to people, well, we said to those who thought the U.S. had influence, is that a negative influence or a positive influence? And overwhelmingly, especially in Western Europe, people thought it was a negative influence. So the next U.S. president is going to inherit an economic situation where people think, in essence, their economies are going to hell in a handbasket, and the U.S. is to blame for this. And I think the onus will be on the next president around the world to do something about the economy. And let's face it, it's very difficult for a president to do that much about the economy. So it will be a severe challenge that he will face. There's also widespread concern, as you might expect, about global warming. I think the most interesting piece of data here is look how little concern there is in the United States. Now, this is, among people, say it's a very serious problem, not a somewhat serious problem. But 9 in 10 Brazilians, 8 in 10 Turks, 7 in 10 Japanese say it's a very serious problem. Only 4 in 10 Americans say it's a serious problem, very serious problem. So despite the fact that Senator McCain and Senator Obama have both said they intend to do more than George Bush did about global warming, it's not at all clear that the American people are ready for the kinds of changes that may entail, or certainly not that the kinds of changes that the rest of the world expects of the United States. Interestingly, in this data is also, it seems to me, again, a sign of parity between us and China. 2 in 10 Chinese think it's a serious problem, very serious problem. 4 in 10 Americans see it's a very serious problem. We are, in fact, linked, or at least our populations are linked in terms of our disregard for this as an issue. And that may be one reason why when we ask people which countries are hurting the environment the most, and we gave people a series of options, basically, overwhelmingly, people said, most likely to say the United States, but second most likely they would say China, which it does seem to me creates, in a perverse sense, sort of way, an opportunity for the next president. We are both considered the culprits here in terms of global warming. It does suggest that if we want, we could find common cause with China to both deal with global warming as a problem, but also to work cooperatively together and not at odds with each other in ways that would probably improve both of our images, because as Richard pointed out, the Chinese image is deteriorating rapidly around the world. One would presume that Beijing is worried about that and would want to do something about that. More data to show that people think China hurts the environment. As you can see, a dramatic increase. The U.S., other countries, where people are now pointing the finger at China as a culprit in terms of hurting the environment. Given the CO2 release data that we now have, with China now becoming the largest single emitter of CO2, I do think that these numbers will probably only get worse before they get better. This has contributed, as you might imagine, to a decline in the views of China, favorability of China, a dramatic drop-off in Europe. Several years ago, the Europeans felt more favorably than the U.S. did about China. Now, most Western Europeans feel more negatively about China. In part that has to do with the environment. In part it has to do with the economy. Bear in mind the Chinese trade surplus with Western Europe. While it's smaller than their surplus with us, it's growing just as rapidly. And we also had other data that we do not show you that show where people are talking, well, actually, I think we do have, yes. Is China's economic power good or bad for your economy? In Africa, it is seen as positive. In Australia, which is selling an enormous amount of coal and other raw materials to China, it's seen as positive. But it's viewed negatively in Western Europe. So this is, again, part of the problem they face in terms of favorability. And it's begun to turn sour in parts of Latin America as well, and in India, certainly, which is feeling increasing competition from Chinese imports. This, it seems to me, is another opportunity, because as we deal with China as the emerging economic superpower, as the next president tries to grapple with how we deal with China as the next economic superpower, there's alliances to be made here with other countries who see China the same way we do. Already, the Bush administration has begun to more closely coordinate its cases in the WTO against China with the Europeans. USTR and the Trade Ministry in Brussels are in daily contact as they coordinate their activities around intellectual property rights, around Chinese subsidies, and things of that nature. It seems to me there's an opportunity here for the next administration to build on these shared public perceptions of China as a way to develop alliances and trade strategies for the next administration. Okay, we've exhausted, I think, your patience in terms of these presentations, but now let's open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Bruce. Let's put this back down here for both of you to share as we do it. Let me just ask one question before I open it up. Those numbers that showed the popularity level of China in the European states, while I didn't see all the numbers, it looked pretty darn close, maybe just a few points less than the United States. It pretty much showed the fact that America is just as unpopular in Europe as China is. And might not the Chinese think that that's a measure of their weight in the world, and thus maybe not a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, as we were saying, I think that there is a lot of parity in many parts of the world in terms of how they feel about the U.S. and China. The one thing that is a more troublesome sign, I think, for China in this regard is that the trend arrow is clearly headed down, in Europe and in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas, what we've seen as far as the U.S. goes over the last year is either sort of a flat pattern or even an uptick in some parts of the world. So, we do see parity, but the trend is headed in different directions right now.
I see. So let me open the floor. Yeah, and I'm going to repeat. You can ask your question, but I'm going to take a slice of it so I can repeat for the internet audience. Right here, and if you'll identify yourself, please.
Oh, no microphone?
No, not today.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Stephen Morris, School of Advanced International Studies, Science at Johns Hopkins. I've read the report very carefully, as I do every year. I think it's one of the most wonderful things that Pew does in this town, and it's always a delight. I want to raise three issues, if I could, very briefly.
I found one. Maybe this does work.
Okay. I'd like to raise three issues. One is Iraq, and you pointed out the fundamental diversion between the Arab countries and the rest of the world in their appreciation of the situation in Iraq, whether it's getting worse or better. But in fact, the reality seems to be that it is getting better. Read this week's Economist, the cover story, the leader, and the special section inside. Last Friday, I attended a Brookings Institution talk with Michael O'Hanlon and Ken Pollock, who've just back, and reported roughly the same thing. The trends are very clearly in a positive direction for the lowering of the level of violence and higher security. So the answer might be that the Arabs know more than we do. That's the first point.
So Iraq?
That's Iraq.
Okay.
Right. Number two, Afghanistan. Very, very unusual. Previous polls have tended to show that the populations of Western Europe support our being in Iraq. That is, support the cause, shall we say, but they don't want to fight. And this is reflected in the facts on the ground. There are only 5 countries which are actually in combat in Iraq: United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands. 4 English-speaking countries and 1 Anglophile European country. interesting point worth contemplating for the future, and about how our foreign policy might be transacted, given the fact that the majority of our European allies don't want to fight for causes they believe are just. And this leads to the third point, Iran. Overwhelming agreement with the United States that Iran is a problem. In fact, the figures show 20% more concern about Iran in countries like Germany and France than in the United States. But then again, previous and different polls show they're not in favor of the use of force. These are facts which need to be contemplated by everybody, but it tends to show that there is a consensus with our allies on objectives, but not on means.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
I mean, I think you're onto something here. I mean, I think that there are, I certainly, not just the Pew surveys, but others that you reference, I've seen what to an American seemed like a contradiction in European attitudes, in the sense that they are in principle in favor of certain things that they're not willing to then either spend money or blood to defend. Practically, I'm not so sure what the consequences of that'll be for the next president. I mean, the Germans have to vote every year on this, on keeping their troops in Afghanistan. I wouldn't want to bet a whole lot of money on their ability to maintain that commitment over time. I think you're right that there's an uptick in, as our data shows, an uptick in Middle Eastern appreciation for the potential that Iraq might succeed, but we should bear in mind that it's still only 2 out of 5 people in the Middle East in our survey think that Iraq will succeed. That's about what it is in the United States. Now, again, to go back to Richard's point, our support's going down, their support seems to be going up a little bit, but we're both at the same place here. Whether, in fact, things are getting better on the ground in Iraq or not, I'm certainly not then in a position to judge. But being a child of the Vietnam War, I never trust when people tell me about how well things are going. But that's just my own prejudice based on my own history. And on Iran, I think, you know, our survey as well shows grave concern about Iran in Europe. But as you pointed out, the Europeans do not seem to be willing to apply the pressure that at least the Bush administration has advocated. Now, based on what Senator McCain has said, we may demand even greater pressure from them if he's president. So that could be another potential rift in the transatlantic relationship. Senator Obama has suggested a different tact. My guess is that would have a lot of support in Europe, at least initially.
See, when you talk to Michael Hanlon and Ken Pollack, I think one of the interesting questions about Iraq is, and I think it's hard to measure, is to what degree the clear diminishment in violence is tied to local chieftains, which I think we're dealing with, getting control of their situation, but based upon a limited expectation of our presence. And given the status of forces agreement that's being negotiated, I think that's going to be a very interesting test of whether those numbers are real or fake, in the sense that it changes dramatically the sense of expectation about what American presence is going to be long term, and to what degree these different players, which are much more at the micro level than at the macro national level, change. I think it's an interesting and important question to work out, and I look forward to hearing what Mike O'Hanlon and Ken Pollack's research yields. Peggy Orchowski, and we'll work around everybody. This is fun.
Thanks. Just a comment on that last one. Wasn't it Churchill who said he was surrounded by European wimps and American cowboys? So as we become less cowboy, it'll be interesting if the wimps become less wimpish. But I want to ask on your survey, I take it this was kind of a man in the street survey, and do you have a difference in the survey of the leaders of leadership? I was at a European embassy party the other day, and it was off the record, but the ambassador there, as a major European country, was very concerned about Obama's lack of experience in Europe, and said that as far as they were concerned, Hillary would be a far better candidate as far as European allies are concerned. So I'm wondering if the romanticism of Obama in the street might be different than in the leadership.
Poland?
No.
Well, in terms of how we conduct these, for the most part, these are nationally representative samples in each country. So you're getting sort of a broad cross-section of the population. You know, our sample looks a lot like the population of a given country looks. You know, we don't do separate surveys among elites. I mean, one way to get at that would be to sort of look at differences by education level, that kind of thing. We haven't done any of that yet, but it's something we might be able to do more of as we push forward and keep digging around this data a little bit more.
Do you find the process getting easier year to year, given from when you first started, when you were dealing with a lot of climates that I seem to recall you were even doing things in Saudi Arabia and whatnot at the beginning?
We haven't done Saudi Arabia, but we've sort of, you know, we over time, I think we've worked kinks out. We've identified places where we can do work really well. We've identified local partners to work with. So yeah, this is each year. I think it gets a little easier to do, and we know.
Have you found any big screw ups year to year where you were just totally off?
None I'm going to mention.
Yeah. All right. Bruce, quick comment now?
I mean, you do find anomalies that you can't explain, and you know whether those are screw-ups or they're just anomalies is probably a different different question. I mean, my experience has been the same as yours on a slightly different set of issues. European elites, for example, it seems to me, have since 2005 been much appreciative of what they see as a Bush administration effort to re-engage with official Europe on a range of topics. As you may recall, the president went to Brussels early in 2005, and that was highly appreciated. And what was interesting back then was you would talk to European elites, and everything was hunky-dory again with Washington. And yet the numbers in the publics were continued to be very bad, and in some cases still going down. So there was, I think, at least from that anecdotal evidence, a disconnect between elite sentiment and public sentiment. But as Richard said, we really don't have surveys of elites, so we don't know.
Go right to this lady right here.
Hi, I'm Caroline.
No, we're going to do it in the mic so that.
I'm Caroline Friedman. I'm an intern with the Atlantic Council. One of your slides showed that American confidence in the outcome of the Iraq War was actually lower than before the surge, which it seems has brought some relative stability, at least since 05, 06, 07 numbers. So I was wondering why you think the confidence has decreased as the results are actually getting better.
I think one thing the domestic polling that's been done on this shows is that with the surge, there was some uptick in terms of people saying that things were going relatively well there, but not necessarily a sea change in terms of how people feel about Iraq as a whole, whether it was a good idea, whether they ultimately believe things are going to improve dramatically there or not.
And Andy, I've heard Andy Kohut, who's the director of Pew, respond to questions like this in the past. And one of the things that he points out, he was at one point the head of Gallup, and he started his career at Gallup long before you were born. And his point was that at some point, I think it was after the '68 Tet Offensive, the U.S. public made up its mind about Vietnam, and it never went back. And I think one of the explanations conceivably to answer to your question may be that the American public has made up its mind about Iraq. And kind of the details of the Iraq war on a day-to-day basis are not going to change that because people have moved on, which I'm sure would be terribly frustrating to the administration if in fact things are getting better on the ground, that they can't fix public opinion, but the Vietnam experience might suggest that once you lose it, you never get it back.
I would also add to that from the moment of the Crocker-Petraeus hearings, the first set of hearings in both the House and the Senate last year, that American strategy, the signal of American strategy was clearly abandoning to some degree the focus on Maliki and the national level and moving to a local level. That didn't necessarily instill confidence on the success of the enterprise. Secondly, another narrative exists, which Nir Rosen, affiliated with New America Foundation, has written a lot, is that a lot of the ethnic reorganization in the country has already occurred. So while death rates may be down, that's not necessarily correlated with success of a presence in sort of Sunni regions. The third thing is the question to which Iran controls the temperature in Iraq. And if Iran wants to turn up the heat on violence or turn down the heat on violence, whatever, I don't know the answer to that, but there are other competing narratives that if you suspended bias, you could sort of make alternative narratives that might help answer that. And I think when you look at that, and particularly we had 4 Shura Council members here from Saudi Arabia, they have their own narrative of what they think is going on. So I think these competing narratives do in fact influence the way others think. It's just we have a prism of the largely, in fact, helping it be framed by people like Mike O'Hanlon, but also Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus, looking at trying to defend a correlation between that surge and the results, but there may be other factors. In the very back. Well, no, we'll go here and then the very, very back. He was the very back, and you're the very, very back.
Thank you. Dmitry Sidorov, Commerce Russian Business and Political Daily. 2 questions. First, how significant do you think is the influence of the government-imposed or influenced propaganda, how it impacted the data you collected and, people's opinions in the countries, in the foreign countries? And the second question is, yes, if you can please name the countries where you think was the case. And the second question is, it seems to me that was kind of change of trend in reaction of the Russians to the positive outcome to the war in Iraq based on the numbers you showed. It was +1. I mean, previously I think the data pointed that their attitude was quite negative. Thank you.
Thank you. So is Russia in the mix?
Yeah.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah.
My apologies. So propaganda and Russia.
Well,
Not correlating them on purpose.
Well, it can be Saudi Arabia
Yeah,
or
yeah,
Jordan
yeah.
or whatever.
Right.
Well, it's a good question. In each of these countries, we work with local researchers who sort of, know how to conduct these surveys in these countries. And there may be a few countries where we know we can ask a particular set of questions. But, over time, we've found that we believe we're getting good, solid, honest responses, and public opinion in these countries seems to change and to vary in ways that sort of make sense. So we feel like in the sort of core set of countries that we've surveyed over time, we're getting pretty good responses, honest responses from these people. I don't know if you want to talk about Russia.
I'm sorry, sir. Will you give me the names of the countries where you weren't able to ask certain questions, please, and the questions you weren't able to ask?
Sure. I don't know that this year we weren't, and there's anything that we presented here that we weren't able to ask. In China, for example, in the past, we have had questions that we sort of knew we wouldn't be able to ask. But for the most part, in the countries that we select, we know that we can ask these questions, and that's sort of, we don't ask a lot of questions we think might be troublesome because we want to be able to compare them.
You didn't ask them, are
countries.
you a Falun Gong member, or?
Well, that would be an example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for example, and we were told early on, not just for this survey, but earlier on, that you can't ask questions about religion in China. Well, eventually you don't ask them, because you can't ask them. I think there were certain questions about the government itself we couldn't ask. And where that's the case, we acknowledge that. I won't tell you which countries, but there have been a couple of countries we have refused. We've been asked to come in and do surveys. People say, oh, we want to be part of your survey. And we say, we look at the conditions or the situation, and we say, we're not going to subject ourselves to that. Or we did it in some countries, it was a bad experience, and we won't do it again.
Was Russia on the list?
No, it's never been on the list.
Okay.
And as far as I know, there's never been really a problem. I mean, in all honesty, there's never been a problem.
There are a number of pollsters who work in Russia. I don't think that any of them have encountered any trouble that I'm aware of. It seems
Right.
like it's a pretty good public opinion sector in Russia.
Right.
Interesting. So very, very back, and then
And,
we'll go up here.
one problem, to the Chinese credit, there are questions we ask in this survey, I can't remember which ones, that
Environment?
we couldn't ask 3 or 4 or 5 years ago.
Environment, I bet.
Yeah, and I don't remember.
Did you ask about corruption?
Well, we have a China report we'll be putting out the next month, and we
Cool.
do get into
Come back.
yeah, exactly. Some of the key issues, domestic issues in China, we have some interesting questions on. So.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Simone Mihashimi with German Public Radio, and I apologize in advance because I think this is kind of a special interest question. I could tell, or everybody could tell from these, from your poll that Western Europe has quite low favorability ratings of the U.S. in particular, but I think Germany was very low in some
31%.
Yeah, in some ways at least. So I was wondering, can you tell anything about why that is? I mean, and in addition, are there any specific, let's say, is there any specific about the views that Germans have on the U.S. in consideration or in comparing to the other countries in Western Europe? Do you think there is any difference, and if it is, why?
Well, in Western Europe in particular, I think a lot of the decline that we've seen over the last few years has to do with U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the Iraq War is extremely unpopular. There's a broad perception that the U.S. acts unilaterally in world affairs. The war on terror has become increasingly unpopular in many Western European countries. So I think that's the explanation in Germany and the other Western European countries that we survey as well.
And we certainly saw in the first surveys, even before the Iraq War, that the Germans in particular were very concerned about the U.S. position on global warming and opposed to the Bush position on global warming. So for that reason, they were already beginning to have trouble with the United States. So I think that, especially in Germany, feeds into this. Now, one of the things that a number of people have pointed out in this survey in raising questions about whether any of this matters is they take a look at Western Europe and they say you have a pro-American chancellor in Germany, you have a pro-American president in France, at least relative to his predecessor, you now have a pro-American head of the Italian government. Doesn't this show that these low support figures in Western Europe don't matter? Well, I would point out to people that A, these people are not elected because of their pro-American attitudes. They may be elected in spite of their pro-American attitudes. They're elected for domestic reasons. It does seem to me, though, limit how far they can go in cooperating with the U.S. on certain issues. The German coalition government has supported the intervention in Afghanistan and continues to support the intervention in Afghanistan. But if you talk to coalition members in the Bundestag about this, they say the sand is going out from underneath their feet. They can't sustain this over time. So I think we can be happy that Chancellor Merkel, for example, is very committed to the transatlantic relationship. It would appear much more committed to the transatlantic relationship than her predecessor. By the same token, it's hard for any elected politician to sustain policies over time that have such strong opposition from the public.
Thank you. Let me go right to this gentleman.
Thank you. Charles Ott from the Department of the Treasury, Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. If you were an appropriator in this town, how might the trending results of this survey over the last 9 years affect your reaction to the State Department's next request for funding for its public diplomacy programs? Thank you.
Very good question.
That's a great.
Jim Glassman was just confirmed last week, and we should send him instructions on what he can do in his new role.
I mean, I think that first off, we should be humble and realize that no amount of money thrown at this problem initially is going to turn it around overnight. And I think that our initial response, the Bush administration's initial response in public diplomacy, was that you could do a number of public relations stunts and all of a sudden people would love us again. And I think our data shows that much of this opposition is based on policy differences, it's based on personality differences, and that's going to take time to change. That said and done, we don't spend enough on public diplomacy, in my personal opinion. We have, in fact, cut back the public diplomacy efforts in Western Europe. There's absolutely no public diplomacy effort in Great Britain, for example. The assumption being they're our best friend. Well, in fact, support for the United States and Great Britain has fallen,
30 points or 20
Yeah.
points. I mean, enormously. I mean, if it's only looks good relative to the rest of Western Europe. And it is true that if you have limited resources, you're probably going to pump that money into the Middle East, you're going to pump it into Asia, and not into Western Europe. But objectively, we should be spending more money in Western Europe as well as the rest of the world, and we aren't. But again, it seems to me there's no silver bullet here.
Mr. Ott, what I would say...
One thing I would just add, that we do learn from an earlier survey, is that people who have personal contact with the United States, either they travel here or they have regular contact with people who live here, are more favorably disposed towards the United States. So public diplomacy does work.
Bruce stole my line. I want to go to this lady here, but before I want to tell Mr. Ott, you know, one of the things that I find very disappointing in the post-9/11 period of screening good people from bad people interested in the United States is that I know, for instance, in the world in which you work, that there's developed hugely sophisticated mechanisms for looking at a great range of people and figuring out how to do them. But when you then move to the Department of Homeland Security's application of various protocols on screening that, even with the people you let in, you subject people coming into this country, particularly from non-visa waivered nations, the most humiliating hurdles to come in. And one of the things I'm recommending to Jim Glassman as a specific line item, which may sound trite, but I do think it's important, again, for many developing nations, is our entry visa fee is about $135 right now just to apply. That's before you may have to make the 2 or 3 trips to meet a consular official for an hour, and then a great number of these are in fact turned down. I think we ought to return that money. I think we ought to return at least a portion of that money to those people who apply to come here who we don't do it. Things like that. And the budgetary element of it, which, you know, the comment from State is that they've got to run this under a certain budget and we're not organized that way. Well, fundamentally, gravity will continue to take us to a place where we tend to offend even our friends. I mean, one of the things, I was again in Saudi Arabia, it's very interesting. You go to King Saud University, and 80 or 90% of the teachers and faculty there have PhDs from the United States. They want their kids to come here. Their kids aren't coming here. They're going elsewhere. And there's that whole generational loss going on, and I think it's very, very blind. And so to some degree, what I'd like to see is the sophistication of your department become more dominant in being able to create a more fine screen between allowing people in and out, and we're not accomplishing that. But
just to follow up on that, Steve, an earlier Pew survey showed that one of the questions that has arisen out of this survey is, why should we care? And we say, well, we have so many illegal immigrants coming to the United States. We have so many people want to be here. People are voting with their feet. We don't care what they tell pollsters. They want to be here. In fact, today, there are more Chinese studying in Western Europe than there are in the United States. Now, this is in part because it's cheaper to go to school in Western Europe, but it's also harder to get into the United States.
it shouldn't be cheaper anymore.
It's right, given the rise in the euro. But the point is that we are not the only game in town anymore. And we also ask people around the world if they, if a young person came to them who had no political reason to come to the U.S., no compelling economic reason to come to the U.S., they just said, look, I can't make it in our society. I got to go someplace else. Where would you recommend? Only the Indians continued to say the United States. Plurality response in other countries was Canada, it was Australia. We are not necessarily the country of choice for many people around the world anymore. They may end up here for a variety of reasons, but we presume, we see ourselves as the place everybody wants to come. In fact, the data would suggest, both in terms of where people are studying and where people are recommending young people to go, we may no longer be that destination of choice.
All right, thank you. Yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Peggy Siegel. You're starting to get to 2 questions I wanted to ask. One was the implications of the perception of the United States on things like wanting to come here, tourism, choices in products made in the USA, et cetera. And then secondly, the impact of the internet and blogging on galvanizing perception to action to, third and finally, inform the president, whoever he may be, of things that could be leveraged effectively on behalf of the United States.
Thanks. Bruce?
Well, I'm not an expert on blogging, so I'll leave that to Steve and his excellent blog. You did raise an interesting point about which we do know something substantive, and that is whether there's an economic cost to this anti-Americanism, and I can at least happily report to you there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. As you may recall, back at the time of the Iraq War and the outcry against the U.S. at that point, there were threats of boycotts in the Middle East and in Europe. And some academics actually did some studies of Western Europe in the post-Iraq War period. They tracked the sales of American icon brands, Coca-Cola, Nike, and they tracked them against their own performance before the Iraq War in Western Europe. Seemed to be no impact. In other words, sales continued to rise at the same pace they'd been rising before the Iraq War. And they tracked them vis-a-vis their European iconic brand competitors, whatever Coke's opposition is or whatever Nike's competitors are. And in fact, they outperformed those. So at least in that universe and in that limited survey, there does not seem to be any economic cost to this anti-Americanism, at least in the short run.
Okay. Let's go to these two, but we'll just gather a couple real quick.
In this media age, you mentioned, Bruce, very briefly, personality as well as policy differences. And it's obvious throughout the world, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, but that's irrelevant, there's this ad hominem dislike of George Bush. Stylistically, whether it's the cowboy syndrome, as somebody indicated. And my question would be, in your data, are there any ways of eliciting how much is personality and how much is policy? Or if a president with a more appealing personality to the rest of the world might somewhat soften anti-Americanism?
Thank you. And this gentleman in the back.
Thomas Watson with the Homeland Security Program at CSIS. I was wondering, did the data reveal any particular steps or policies the U.S. could change towards Muslim countries to improve our standing or perceptions among like the Muslim nations or the Arab world?
Muslim countries, was it a question over here? Yes, sir, this gentleman.
Not related to this.
That's okay. Let me get the microphone to you.
I wonder how much we should really be concerned that 80% of the French think that our economy is bothering them. They haven't won anything since 1036. I don't see that they really are in a position to talk. The other thing is, too, that don't you think a lot of this is trade related? I mean, certainly...
Great question for Bruce Stokes.
Yeah. A lot of it stems from, you know, all this plant engineering and that sort of thing. They froze us out, saying that it was causing environmental problems because it was chemical, which it wasn't. But, I mean, that was a great trade issue that I'm sure upset a lot of the French. And I think the survey probably very weak on that front.
Great.
Because they didn't ask why.
Thank you. 3 good questions. Why don't you divide them up?
On the anti-Bush personality question, as I mentioned, not in this survey, but in one of the previous surveys, we asked people who said they were not favorably disposed towards the United States. He says primarily Bush or primarily America, and overwhelmingly it was primarily Bush, and that demonstrated itself in a number of different surveys. So clearly, personality plays a huge role. I know in even before the Iraq War, in talking to Europeans, it was Bush's personality, it was his cavalier treatment of issues, say, for example, that Europeans held near and dear, like global warming, that enraged them. And it is the unilateralism, which in part is not necessarily what you do, but how you treat people in the process. I think, for example, one of the challenges facing the next president, whoever it may be, is that as the world's most important superpower, we're going to do things that are in our self-interest, whether people like it or not, to a certain extent. And because there's such expectation that the U.S. will act and will be good for the world and do good for the world, it's inevitable that the next American president will do things that he thinks are in the world's interest, that he thinks are in America's interest, and will be perceived as being unilateral just because we'll act rather than consult ad nauseum. Because we're Americans and we like to act, and other people like to move more slowly and consult. We can debate that at a different time, but it seems to me that's part of our personality trait. So I do think that the personality of the next president will, at the margin, have an impact. The fact that it's not President Bush will be an upside for a while. The fact that the world expects so much out of the next president, and because Americans tend to, at the end of the day, want to act as opposed to consult, I do think there'll be a problem with our unilateralism. As we can see, people around the world think the Chinese are unilateral. I mean, superpowers tend to act unilaterally. We at the margin can probably affect that by personality, but not completely. On the last question, and Rich is going to deal with the Muslim question, it probably doesn't surprise me that the French are at the kind of upper end of the scale. There's a lot of anti-American sentiment in France. We have had particular issues, as you acknowledged, around genetically modified organisms, for example, and the trade in genetically modified organisms. The French, I think, are more prone to be supportive of subsidies, for example, for farmers, than say some other Europeans and Brits or whatever. So there's tensions with the U.S., although why they'd have tensions with us, given the fact that we subsidize our farmers even more than they do. But I do think that there is, our data show, we didn't throw up a slide on this, that there is a declining support for trade in Europe, including in France. Actually, it's declining faster in the U.S. than it is in Western Europe. And there's a widespread concern about foreign investment in France. Also widespread concern about foreign investment here. But you're right, I think I can understand how the French would be high in terms of some of those numbers in our survey.
Well, it's hard for them to compete, too, with a 35-hour week and give every worker...
Yeah, we'd have a debate about France. I mean, I think our perception of France is not quite the reality in France. It is interesting that the French are overwhelmingly enthusiastic about Obama, which I think fits their narrative about America, and also their projection on us that somehow we, the French, haven't maybe handled our racial problems as well as we think we should have. But the Americans, we have these aspirations, and this is their aspiration is that we can somehow, even though they're very critical of the way we've handled our race relations in the past, that we're solving them. This is, the French.
But this is the Fareed Zakaria line, that his very identity demonstrates or projects this international sensitivity, which raises the question of whether it really does or not. Because, and I think one of the questions when you get to the Muslim part of this is whether or not, if there's a lot of doubt in the world about how we behave, both from allies and foes, I can imagine this sort of Chinese water torture, or sort of pinpricks from everywhere trying to measure what we really care about in the world and how the president is going to react. And of course, if he does react, you end up with a reactive presidency as opposed to a proactive presidency when the expectations are for a proactive, internationally sensitive president. So to some degree, we could be setting ourselves for a big rise and a huge fall. But
well, in terms of how the U.S. is viewed in Muslim nations, I mean, we don't go out and test 3 or 4 different things that the U.S. could do to improve its image and see which one works best. But we do find that there continue to be things people like about America in Muslim populations. I mean, American business practices actually tend to be still fairly popular. American science and technology, even in some places American popular culture, all tend to get relatively positive marks in Muslim publics. And moreover, I mean, our polling shows some good things happening in the Muslim world that aren't necessarily related to the United States, but nonetheless are probably good things for American foreign policy. Suicide bombing, support for suicide bombing has declined dramatically over the last 5 years in just about every Muslim country that we survey. There continues to be broad support for democracy in the Muslim publics that we survey, and there tends to be broad support for economic globalization in Muslim publics as well. So, I don't know that we necessarily test a plan for improving America's image, but I think there's some things in our data that those who do can draw on in Muslim publics.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank Bruce and Robert for a fantastic portal into some very interesting changing trends and global attitudes. You can download the report at pewglobal.org, pewglobal.org. I know you can download the executive summary or the fuller report. I want to thank Bruce for putting us first on the think tank roster for the dissemination of the report. And Rich, thank you very much for joining us. Please extend a hand. Thanks. Very good.